There are moments in a hospital when an entire room falls silent, not because of bad news, but because the test results in front of the doctors simply shouldn't exist. A woman returned to the hospital to donate bone marrow and save her mother after being rejected by her own family for years. But when the oncologist ran the DNA tests, something appeared that made her freeze. The test was run again, and then again. Soon, the hospital board was called in. What they saw didn't just threaten a transplant, it threatened to tear apart an entire family. People often say family is everything. Blood ties are supposed to be the strongest bond a person can have. But what happens when science suddenly proves that someone doesn't belong to the very family they spent their whole life trying to love? Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. And now, let's hear her out. My name is Varelli. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've lived alone in a small wooden cabin on the edge of the desert outside Sedona, Arizona. It sits just far enough from town that the nights are quiet and the sky is clear enough to see every star. Most mornings, I wake up before sunrise, step out onto the porch, and watch the red cliffs slowly catch fire with the first light of the day. People come to Sedona looking for peace or answers or some kind of spiritual reset. For me, it was simply the only place far enough away from my old life. I work as a trekking guide, leading small groups of tourists along the trails that wind through the red rock formations around Cathedral Rock and Bell Rock. Sometimes I bring a camera along and sell a few landscape photos online. It's not a glamorous life, but it's quiet, predictable. And most importantly, it belongs to me. Almost no one here knows who I used to be. 3 years ago, I was Varelli of Scottsdale, daughter of Victor Varelli, the man who owned half the luxury car dealerships in Arizona. My parents lived in a sprawling home in Paradise Valley, the kind of house with iron gates and a driveway that curved like it belonged to a resort. And 3 years ago, that life ended. I still remember the moment clearly. My father standing in the middle of the dining room during his birthday dinner, a dozen relatives sitting around the long table. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He just looked at me with the same cold expression he used when negotiating business deals. "We're ashamed you're mine," he said. That sentence didn't just end an argument, it erased me. Within days, my access to the family bank accounts disappeared. My name quietly vanished from a trust fund I'd been listed in since childhood. Even the framed family photos in the house were replaced, my face removed like I'd never been there at all. I packed what I could fit in my car and left Scottsdale before the week was over. Sedona became my refuge. 3 years is a long time to learn how to live without a family, long enough to build a routine that doesn't include them, long enough that some mornings I almost forget they exist. Almost. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, I was sitting on the porch of my cabin with a mug of coffee in my hands, watching the sun climb slowly over Cathedral Rock. The air was cool and smelled faintly of juniper. My phone buzzed on the small wooden table beside me. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. I get enough spam calls from travel agencies and credit card offers that I've learned to let most numbers go straight to voicemail. But something made me answer. "Hello," a calm, professional voice responded. "Is this Varelli?" "Yes. This is Dr. Anika Serrano from Banner MD Anderson Cancer Center in Phoenix." The words hit me like a sudden change in altitude. Phoenix, hospital. My mind began racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. "I'm calling about your mother, Marlene Varelli," the doctor continued. I sat up straighter in the chair. What happened? She was admitted 2 days ago. She's been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. For a moment, the desert around me went completely silent. Leukemia. Dr. Serrano explained that the disease was aggressive. Marlene's best chance of survival was a bone marrow transplant, and the sooner they found a compatible donor, the better. "We've already tested immediate family members," she said. "Your brother Dominic was evaluated, but unfortunately, he's not a match." Of course he wasn't, I thought bitterly. The golden son had always been lucky, except when it came to things that actually mattered. "We're contacting you because close relatives often have the highest chance of compatibility," she continued. "Would you be willing to come in for testing?" The question hung in the air between us. 3 years. 3 years since anyone in my family had spoken to me. 3 years since my father looked me in the eye and said he was ashamed to call me his daughter, and now they needed something. I stared out across the red desert, remembering the night I left Scottsdale, the way the gate closed behind my car like the final page of a book. "You still there?" Dr. Serrano asked gently. "Yes," I said quietly. What shocked me wasn't the news about my mother. It was the realization that somewhere deep in the hospital system, my phone number still existed. They had erased me from everything else, but not that. "Will you come in for testing?" she asked again. For a few seconds, I said nothing. Then I heard my own voice answer, "I'll be there today." After the call ended, I sat on the porch for a long time, staring at the empty desert. My coffee had gone cold in my hands. Eventually, I stood up, grabbed my keys, and locked the cabin behind me. 3 hours later, I was driving south through the wide Arizona desert toward Phoenix, toward the family that had pushed me out of their lives. The road stretched endlessly ahead, heat shimmering above the asphalt. And somewhere during that long drive, a question kept circling in my head. Was I going back because I still cared about my mother, or because some part of me still wanted to be her daughter? Banner M.D. Anderson Cancer Center sits in the northern part of Phoenix, a massive complex of glass and steel that looks more like a corporate headquarters than a hospital. By the time I arrived that afternoon, the parking lot was nearly full. Inside the building hummed with quiet tension. Families sat in clusters along the hallways, some whispering, some crying, some staring blankly at the floor, as if the answers they needed might appear there. Cancer wards always carry a strange kind of silence. Not quiet exactly, but heavy. I followed the signs toward the oncology wing until I reached a long corridor lined with patient rooms, and that's where I saw him. My father stood near the end of the hallway, hands in his pockets, staring out through a window at the parking lot below. He wore one of his usual tailored suits, dark gray with a crisp white shirt. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. Victor Varelli had always been intimidating, sharp, confident, larger than the room he walked into. But now there were deeper lines around his mouth, and the silver in his hair had spread further than I remembered. He turned when he heard my footsteps. Our eyes met. 3 years of silence stretched between us. "Alawan," he said. No hug, no smile, just my name spoken like a business formality. Dad. He nodded once, then gestured down the hallway. "Marlene needs a transplant. They're hoping you might be compatible." That was it. Not "how have you been?" Not "it's good to see you." Just the medical problem that had brought me here. "I know," I said. The doctor explained it. He studied me for a moment, as if evaluating whether I had changed in ways that might matter to him. "You drove from Sedona, yes." He nodded again. "Good." That single word carried the same tone he used with employees who had completed a task. Before either of us could say more, another familiar face stepped into view. My older brother, Dominic, stood near the nurses' station with his wife, Lauren. Dominic had inherited most of our father's physical traits: dark hair, sharp jawline, the same confident posture. Lauren gave me a polite nod. Dominic didn't meet my eyes. No one mentioned the last time we'd been in the same room together. The silence said everything. A nurse approached us a few minutes later and told me that Dr. Serrano was ready to begin the compatibility testing. The laboratory area was bright and spotless, filled with machines that hummed softly as technicians moved between stations. Dr. Serrano greeted me with a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming in so quickly," she said. She explained the procedure carefully. Blood samples would be taken to analyze my HLA markers, the genetic indicators used to determine bone marrow compatibility. They would also run DNA comparisons against my family's existing records to verify potential matches. If the markers align closely enough, she said you could become a viable donor. I signed the consent forms without hesitation. A nurse began drawing blood, filling one vial after another. As the dark red liquid flowed through the thin plastic tubes, a strange thought crossed my mind. 3 years ago, my family had decided I no longer belonged to them. But now, the one thing that might save my mother's life was something they couldn't erase: my blood. When the final sample was sealed, Dr. Serrano placed the labeled vials in a tray. "We should have preliminary results in a few hours," she said. A few hours. I returned to the waiting area outside the oncology ward. Families moved in and out of the room around me. A young boy with a baseball cap hugged his mother. An elderly man sat beside his daughter, holding her hand as if afraid to let go. I watched them quietly, feeling like a visitor in a world that used to be mine. Somewhere behind the hospital doors, my mother lay in a bed fighting leukemia, and I found myself wondering something I hadn't expected to ask. If the test came back positive, if I really was the match they needed, did I actually want to come back into this family's life, or had I already left it behind for good? 3 hours passed in the hospital waiting room, but time didn't move the way it normally does. In places like oncology wards, minutes stretch into something heavier. Every second seems tied to someone's future. I sat near the far wall, close to a large window that overlooked the parking lot. Outside, the Phoenix sun had climbed high enough to bleach the sky pale blue. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee from a vending machine down the hall. Families filled most of the chairs around me. A young couple sat across from me, whispering to each other, while holding hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. A boy no older than 10 ran past the waiting area wearing a hospital bracelet and dragging an IV stand beside him, while his father followed close behind, trying to keep up. Watching them stirred something uncomfortable in my chest. It reminded me of childhood moments I rarely allowed myself to think about anymore. I had grown up in a sprawling home in Paradise Valley, a neighborhood where houses sat behind high gates and carefully trimmed hedges. From the outside, our family probably looked perfect, wealthy parents, 2 children, a life of security and privilege. But warmth had never really lived in that house. My father had always been busy building his empire of luxury car dealerships across Arizona. Meetings, conferences, late-night phone calls. Even when he was home, his mind was somewhere else. My mother, Marlene, had always been polite, composed, and distant. She handled charity events, social gatherings, and the endless calendar of appearances expected of a family like ours. But she rarely showed the kind of affection I saw other mothers give their children. Dominic fit into that world easily. He shared my father's ambition, his discipline, even his mannerisms. I never did. As I sat there watching the families around me, something else began resurfacing in my memory, details I had ignored most of my life. Physical differences. Dominic had my father's dark hair and my mother's brown eyes. The resemblance between them was obvious even to strangers. But I had always looked different. My hair was a darker shade of blonde, and my eyes were a gray-blue color that didn't exist anywhere else in the family. When I was 8 years old, I once asked my mother about it. I remember standing in the kitchen while she prepared dinner. "Why don't I look like you and Dad?" I had asked. She had smiled and brushed a strand of hair behind my ear. "Genes can be unpredictable," she said. "Sometimes they skip around." At the time, that answer seemed good enough. Now, sitting in the hospital waiting room 34 years later, that memory felt different, like a puzzle piece that had never quite fit. I was staring down at my hands when I heard my name, Ms. Varelli. I looked up to see Dr. Serrano standing in the doorway of the waiting area. Her expression was calm, but something in her posture felt unusually formal. "Could you come with me, please?" I followed her down the hallway past several examination rooms. Instead of returning to the lab where my blood had been drawn earlier, she led me to a small conference room near the end of the corridor. When she opened the door, I saw 2 other people already inside. One was an older man wearing a white coat with the hospital logo stitched on the pocket. His name tag identified him as Dr. Harold Kenning, head of hematology. The other was a woman I hadn't seen before, seated beside him, with a thick folder open on the table. Her badge read, Dr. Lila Grant, Genetic Specialist. All three of them were looking at the same set of documents. For a moment, no one spoke. Dr. Serrano gestured toward a chair. Please sit down. I did suddenly aware that the air in the room felt tighter than it should have. Dr. Serrano folded her hands together on the table. Before we discuss anything, I want you to know that we've reviewed these results very carefully. The words immediately made my stomach tighten. Am I not a match? I asked. The doctors exchanged brief glances. That's not exactly the issue, she replied. I frowned. What does that mean? Dr. Grant turned the folder toward me, though the charts and genetic markers meant very little to my untrained eyes. We ran your compatibility test, Dr. Serrano said slowly, and when the results came back, they didn't make sense. So you ran it again? We did. And then a third time, Dr. Grant added. My pulse began to quicken. Okay, I said cautiously, and Dr. Serrano took a breath. The problem isn't that you're not compatible with your mother for a transplant. My confusion deepened. Then what is it? The room went quiet again. Then she looked directly at me. According to the DNA analysis, she said carefully, you have no biological relationship to Victor Varelli, Marlene Varelli, or Dominic Varelli. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. That's impossible, I said. No one responded. The silence stretched long enough for the weight of her words to sink in. You're saying, I'm not a match, I asked again. Dr. Grant shook her head gently. We're saying something much more significant than that. She slid the genetic report closer to me. Based on these results, she said you cannot be the biological daughter of the family you grew up with. The words seemed to drain all the sound from the room. For several seconds after Dr. Grant finished speaking, I couldn't move. My mind tried to reject what I had just heard the same way the body sometimes refuses to process pain right away. You need to explain that again, I said finally. Dr. Serrano opened the report and pointed to several sections filled with colored genetic markers. These are HLA markers, she explained. They're inherited patterns in DNA that allow us to determine compatibility between individuals. She tapped a section on the page. If you were the biological daughter of Victor and Marlene Varelli, we would expect to see overlapping markers here, at least some degree of genetic alignment. She paused, but there are none. I stared at the page without understanding any of it. There has to be a mistake, I said. We considered that possibility immediately, Dr. Grant replied. That's why we repeated the test 3 times. 3. And we verified the results through 2 separate lab systems. I leaned back in the chair, trying to steady the sudden pounding in my chest. You're telling me that after 34 years, I'm just not their daughter. No one spoke. Dr. Serrano finally said quietly, genetically speaking, that appears to be the case. The hospital informed my family shortly afterward. They arrived in the conference room within minutes. My father entered first, his expression sharp and controlled the way it always became during business disputes. Dominic followed behind him, looking uncertain with Lauren trailing quietly a few steps back. What is this about? My father asked. Dr. Serrano summarized the findings. As soon as she finished, the reaction was immediate. This is absurd, my father said flatly. He didn't even look at me. There's obviously been a lab error. Dr. Kenning folded his hands calmly. We anticipated that concern, he said, which is why the test was repeated multiple times. That doesn't mean anything, my father snapped. Run it again. Dominic shifted uncomfortably beside him, but didn't argue. I watched the two of them closely. Neither of them seemed shocked in the way I expected, more irritated than surprised. Dr. Serrano nodded. We're prepared to run a 4th test under full supervision to eliminate any possibility of error. My father crossed his arms. Good. The additional test took another hour. During that time, Dr. Grant began reviewing historical medical records connected to my birth. That's when she noticed something unusual. She returned to the room holding a tablet. There's another issue we need to discuss, she said. Everyone looked at her. I've been reviewing the hospital records from the facility where Elowen was born, and my father asked impatiently, "There's a gap, yes. The newborn blood screening that is normally performed immediately after birth isn't recorded in the system." Dominic frowned, so Dr. Grant shook her head. "That test has been mandatory in Arizona hospitals for decades. The absence of it in the records is extremely unusual." She scrolled through the files. The record lists Victor and Marlene Varelli as the parents, but there are no early genetic markers, no neonatal screening, and no archived blood sample. Silence filled the room again. For the first time since the conversation began, I noticed my mother. She had been standing near the door the entire time. Her hands were trembling slightly. When Dr. Grant mentioned the missing records, Marlene lowered her gaze and avoided looking at anyone. Something in my chest tightened. I had seen that expression before. "Guilt. Mom," I said quietly. She didn't respond. The fourth test results arrived shortly afterward. Dr. Kenning reviewed the report and then looked up. The new test confirms the previous findings. No one spoke. "There is no biological relationship between Elowen and the Varelli family," he said. My father's jaw tightened. Dr. Grant closed the file slowly. Given the data, she said there are only two plausible explanations. She looked directly at me. Either there was a newborn mix-up at the hospital when you were born, or the birth records themselves were altered. The room felt colder than it had a few minutes earlier, and for the first time in my life, I realized something terrifying. My parents might have known far more about this than they had ever admitted. The door closed behind the doctors, and suddenly the conference room felt much smaller. For the first time since the results had been announced, it was just the four of us. My father stood near the window with his back turned, staring down at the parking lot several floors below. Dominic sat stiffly in his chair beside Lauren, though she had quietly stepped out of the room a few minutes earlier, leaving him alone with the rest of us. My mother sat across from me, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned pale. No one spoke. The silence stretched long enough that it began to feel unbearable. I looked at each of them one by one. Dominic wouldn't meet my eyes, my father hadn't turned around, and my mother looked like she was trying very hard not to fall apart. That was the moment something clicked in my mind. The shock I felt sitting there, the ground shifting under everything I thought I knew about my life, wasn't reflected on their faces. They didn't look surprised. They looked cornered. I leaned forward slightly. "Did you know I asked?" No one answered. I kept my voice steady. "Did you already know about this?" My father didn't move. Dominic shifted in his chair. My mother's shoulders trembled. "Mom," I said quietly. She lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were red now. "Elowen," she whispered. The sound of my name in her voice felt strange, almost fragile. "How long?" I asked. My father finally turned around. "This isn't the place for this conversation," he said sharply. "No," I said. "It is exactly the place." My voice surprised even me. For 34 years, I thought I knew who my family was. 5 minutes ago, I found out I don't even belong to the people who raised me. I gestured toward the genetic report still sitting on the table. So I'm asking again, did you know the room went quiet again? Then my mother began to cry. It wasn't loud crying. It was the kind of quiet breaking sound people make when they've been holding something inside for a very long time. My father closed his eyes for a moment, as if bracing himself. "It started long before you were born," my mother said finally. Her voice was shaky. "I couldn't have children." I blinked. "What?" "For years," she continued. "Victor and I tried. We saw specialists in Phoenix, Los Angeles, everywhere." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Nothing worked. Dominic looked down at the table. Apparently, this wasn't news to him. There was a fertility program at a hospital here in Phoenix, she said. One of the early assisted reproduction programs. I listened carefully, trying to piece together what she was telling me. They recommended IVF, she said. But my eggs weren't viable, so they used a donor egg, I said slowly. She nodded. And a surrogate. The words settled into the room. So even from the beginning, I said quietly. She nodded again. I was never genetically related to you. My father spoke, then his tone still controlled but colder than ever. That arrangement was private. No one outside the immediate family was ever meant to know. I felt something tighten in my chest. So you raised me knowing I wasn't biologically yours. My mother hesitated. Yes, but that's not the whole story, she added. Her hands began trembling again. The baby carried by the surrogate didn't survive. The sentence landed in the room like a dropped weight. What do you mean? There were complications during delivery, she said. The baby died shortly after birth. My mind struggled to process the words. So if that baby died, then where did I come from? My mother looked at my father before answering. The hospital was chaotic that night, she said slowly. There were multiple births happening at the same time. My father's jaw tightened. The staff told us there had been an error, he said. They said another child had been mistakenly assigned to us in the paperwork, and that child was me, I said. Neither of them corrected me. So you just took a random baby home. It wasn't random, my father snapped. The hospital assured us the situation was being handled how they told us the other family's child had died shortly after birth. The room went quiet again. And you believed them. My father didn't respond. My mother spoke instead. We had already lost the baby we were expecting, she said softly. We couldn't go through that again. So you kept me. Yes, for 34 years. She nodded. And you never thought I deserved to know any of this. My father answered before she could. It would have destroyed the family, he said. I let out a short laugh. That's interesting. No one spoke. Then another question surfaced in my mind. When did you find out the DNA truth? I asked. My father hesitated. When I was 19, I said quietly. His silence confirmed it. You tested me. He finally nodded. Yes, a private lab. And that's when you learned I wasn't related to you at all. Yes. I sat back slowly. So everything changed after that. Dominic shifted uncomfortably. My father didn't deny it. We had responsibilities, he said, a reputation, to who I asked, to everyone who depended on our name. I stared at him. And I was a liability. You were a complication. The words felt even colder than I expected. So the reason you threw me out 3 years ago, he didn't hesitate this time, had nothing to do with any scandal, he said. The truth hung in the air between us. You removed me because I wasn't actually your daughter. He met my eyes without flinching. Yes. For a long moment after my father said it, no one moved. The words didn't feel like an argument or a confession. They felt like a final verdict. I sat there looking at the man who had raised me, suddenly unsure how much of my life had ever been real. Memories began replaying in my mind. Family vacations, birthday dinners, the afternoons my father had taught Dominic how to drive while I watched from the porch. Had all of that been genuine, or had it simply been obligation? My mother reached across the table slightly. Elowen. I pulled my hands back before she could touch them. Don't, I said quietly. The door opened behind us. Dr. Serrano stepped back into the room, followed by Dr. Grant. They both paused when they noticed the tension in the air. I'm sorry to interrupt, Dr. Serrano said gently, but we have new information regarding the transplant results. My father immediately straightened. Is there a match? He asked. Dr. Serrano looked at me. There's something unusual in the compatibility analysis. She placed another report on the table. Although the DNA test confirms there is no biological relationship between you and Marlene Varelli, the HLA markers show partial compatibility. My father frowned. What does that mean? It means that despite the lack of genetic relation, Elowen's bone marrow markers are close enough to be considered for transplantation. Dominic leaned forward. That's possible? It's extremely rare, Dr. Grant said, but not impossible. She turned the report toward us. The probability of this occurring between unrelated individuals is very low. The room fell quiet again. My mother looked at me with wide eyes. So, she could still save me? Dr. Serrano nodded. If we cannot locate a stronger donor, a Leeuwen may be the best available option. My father stared at the documents, clearly trying to process the irony of the situation. The daughter he had disowned might now be the only person capable of saving his wife's life. While the doctors explained the next steps, something my mother said earlier returned to my mind. "You mentioned the hospital where I was born," I said suddenly. Everyone looked at me. "You said there had been problems there." My mother hesitated. There was an investigation years later, she admitted, about what errors in newborn records. My heart began beating faster. "You mean babies being switched?" She nodded slowly. "It happened in a few cases." Dr. Grant exchanged a look with Dr. Serrano. "That information could be significant," she said. "Significant how I asked. If a newborn mix-up occurred," she said carefully, "there may still be records linking you to another family." The words echoed in my mind. Another family. People somewhere in the world who might share my blood. People who might not even know I exist. For the first time since this conversation began, the question wasn't just about the Varelli family. It was about who I actually was. I looked around the room again. At my father, at Dominic, at the woman who had raised me but now felt like a stranger. Then I turned back to the doctors. "When would the transplant happen?" I asked. Dr. Serrano blinked slightly. "You're still willing to proceed?" I stood up slowly. I didn't drive 3 hours from Sedona just to walk away. My father looked at me in silence. For the first time in years, he seemed completely unsure what to say. "It doesn't matter whether you consider me your daughter," I continued quietly. I glanced toward the hospital room where my mother was recovering. She still raised me. The room stayed silent. "So run whatever tests you need," I said. "I'll do the transplant." Once I agreed to move forward with the transplant evaluation, the hospital shifted into a different rhythm around me. Instead of waiting rooms and tense family conversations, my days became filled with tests, consultations, and long sessions inside parts of the hospital most visitors never see. The hematology department had an entire floor dedicated to transplant preparation. The rooms were bright and sterile, filled with machines quietly monitoring everything from blood counts to immune response markers. Every morning, nurses drew more blood. Every afternoon, specialists explained new procedures. Dr. Serrano and Dr. Grant reviewed the compatibility results again and again, making sure every detail was correct. They told me more than once how unusual the situation was. Two people with no genetic relationship rarely shared compatible HLA markers at the level required for a bone marrow transplant. The statistical probability was extremely small, but somehow my markers aligned closely enough with Marlene's that the transplant could move forward. The doctors didn't use words like miracle. They simply called it rare. While those tests continued, another investigation had quietly begun. Dr. Grant had asked the hospital records department to search deeper into the circumstances of my birth. The facility where I had been born decades earlier was still operating under a different name in Phoenix, and many of its archived records had been transferred to a digital system years ago. One afternoon, she asked me to meet her in a small consultation room. "There's something you should know," she said. She opened a tablet and showed me a report from the archive system. On the day you were born, there was an internal incident recorded at the hospital. "What kind of incident?" I asked. "A documentation issue involving 2 newborn patients." I stared at the screen. "You mean babies were switched?" She didn't answer immediately. "The report doesn't use that exact wording," she said carefully, "but it describes a situation where identification tags may have been incorrectly assigned between 2 families. The record had been closed within weeks. According to the file, the hospital's legal team had decided the case did not require further investigation." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what that meant. So it's possible, I said slowly, that I was given to the wrong family the day I was born. Dr. Grant nodded. Yes. The hospital had already begun searching the archived birth records from that day. There had been another delivery within the same time window. Another girl. Her parents were listed as Miguel and Teresa Alvarez residents of a small suburb outside Phoenix, but the file attached to that birth carried a tragic note. The Alvarez baby had died a few days later due to respiratory complications. I stared at the screen for a long time after Dr. Grant finished explaining. If the hospital had made a mistake that night, then the story written in those records might not be true. There was a possibility I couldn't stop thinking about. Maybe the child born to the Alvarez family had survived. Maybe that child was me, which would mean the baby taken home by the Varelli family might have been the one who later died. If that were true, my identity had been misplaced from the very beginning. While the hospital staff continued searching for more records, the transplant date moved closer. Marlene's condition was deteriorating quickly. Her white blood cell counts had dropped dangerously low, and chemotherapy had already pushed her body to its limits. The doctors scheduled the transplant for the following morning. The evening before the procedure, a nurse told me Marlene wanted to see me. It was the first time we had been alone together since I arrived. Her hospital room was dim, the lights softened to help her rest. She looked smaller than I remembered her skin, pale from the treatments. When I stepped inside, she opened her eyes. "Ilawan," she said quietly. I sat down in the chair beside her bed. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she reached for my hand. "I never wanted things to end the way they did," she said. "I didn't respond right away. It was easier for me to stay silent." She continued, "Your father has always been certain about the way he thinks things should be." "You let him throw me out," I said. Her eyes filled with tears. "I know." The apology came slowly. "I should have stopped it. I should have told you the truth years ago." She looked down at our hands. I was afraid of losing everything. I studied her face. This woman had raised me. She had packed my school lunches and driven me to piano lessons and signed every permission slip when I was a child. She might not have been my biological mother, but she had still been there. "I'm not doing this for the Varelli family," I said finally. She looked up. "I'm doing it because you raised me," I continued. The words seemed to bring her a kind of quiet relief. Later that night, I lay awake in the hospital room they had assigned me, staring at the ceiling. The decision to donate no longer felt like an obligation. It was simply the choice I had made for myself. The surgery began early the next morning. The operating suite was cold and bright. The anesthesiologist explained the process again before the medication began to take effect. They would extract marrow from my pelvic bone and prepare it for transfusion into Marlene's bloodstream. The procedure took several hours. When I woke later in recovery, everything felt distant and heavy. A nurse checked my vitals and told me the transplant had gone according to plan. Now all anyone could do was wait. The days following the transplant moved slowly. Marlene was placed in a specialized isolation unit where the doctors could monitor whether the new bone marrow would begin producing healthy blood cells. The risk of infection was extremely high during this stage, so visits were limited and tightly controlled. While she recovered, I stayed in Phoenix. I rented a small room at a motel about 10 minutes from the hospital. It wasn't much, just a bed, a desk, and a window that faced a busy intersection, but it gave me somewhere quiet to think. Every day I returned to the hospital for updates. Sometimes I sat with Dominic in the waiting area. Sometimes my father was there. The conversations between us were brief and cautious. Too much had happened for easy words. About a week after the transplant, Dr. Grant asked to see me again. "We've made progress on the birth records investigation," she said. She explained that the hospital had located the Alvarez family. Miguel and Teresa Alvarez were still alive. They had moved years earlier and were now living in Tucson. Their records confirmed that they had lost a newborn daughter the same day I had been born. The hospital asked if I would be willing to participate in a DNA comparison. I agreed. The test results came back 2 days later. When Dr. Grant placed the report in front of me, the conclusion was clear. I was genetically related to Miguel and Teresa Alvarez. The numbers left no room for doubt. The child they believed they had lost decades ago was sitting in front of the doctor reading the report. News of the result was shared with the Alvarez family. They responded through the hospital first. They said they would welcome the chance to meet me, but they didn't want to disrupt my life if I wasn't ready. For the first time in my life, I had the possibility of another family, but the idea felt complicated. The people who raised me were still here, still part of my story. And the people who shared my blood had lived for 34 years, believing their daughter was gone. While I tried to sort through those emotions, the doctors continued monitoring Marlene's recovery. One afternoon, Dr. Serrano met me outside the isolation ward. "The new marrow is active," she said. I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time in days. It's working, yes. The transplant had taken hold. Marlene's body had begun producing healthy blood cells again. Her chances of survival had improved dramatically. A few days later, I was allowed to see her briefly. She looked tired but stronger than before. "Thank you," she said when I entered the room. I didn't know what to say. Across the hall, my father stood waiting. When I stepped out of the room, he looked at me carefully. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but they seemed difficult for him to say. I let pride decide something that should never have been decided that way. I listened without interrupting. But apologies, even sincere ones, don't erase the past. A week later, Marlene's condition stabilized enough that the doctors began discussing discharge plans. My work in Sedona was waiting. Before leaving Phoenix, I visited the hospital one last time. I said goodbye to Marlene, who promised to stay in contact. Dominic shook my hand quietly. My father walked me to the parking lot. Neither of us spoke much. Then I drove north across the desert toward Sedona. The red cliffs appeared on the horizon just as the sun began to set. My cabin was exactly the way I had left it. Life there hadn't changed. I stayed in contact with the Alvarez family through phone calls and messages. One day we would probably meet, but there was no rush. Some truths take time to settle into place. As I stood on my porch that evening, watching the last light fade across the desert, I realized something important. The truth about where I came from had broken apart the story I thought I understood. But the choices I made afterward, that was the part of the story that belonged entirely to me. Some truths arrive quietly. And when they do, they don't always bring anger or victory with them. Sometimes they simply leave us standing in a new place, looking at our lives with clearer eyes. Alawan's story reminds us that family is more complicated than a name on a record or the patterns inside our DNA. The people who raise us shape us. The choices we make reveal who we truly become. And in moments when the past feels broken, compassion can still open a door that pride once closed. Maybe that's something many of us recognize in our own lives. We all carry pieces of history that don't fit neatly together. Yet somehow, kindness, especially when it isn't required, has a quiet way of giving those pieces meaning. If this story stayed with you for a moment, you're always welcome here. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story we share in this little space, where people simply listen, reflect, and learn from one another. And if you'd like, feel free to leave a few lines in the comments about where you're watching from, or what part of Alawan's journey touched you the most. Until next time, thank you for spending these moments with us. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you again very soon.